There is something deeply uncomfortable happening right now that most mainstream outlets are barely touching, and the people who are closest to the situation, the ones who actually understand how modern warfare works on the ground, are sounding alarms that are going completely unanswered. What you are about to hear is not speculation from an armchair analyst or a think tank commentator sitting in a comfortable office thousands of miles away from any conflict. This comes from someone embedded in the reality of the situation, someone whose military background gives him a perspective that most people simply do not have access to. And what he is saying is blunt, uncomfortable, and in many ways more revealing about the true state of this conflict than anything you will find in official statements or government press releases. Let us start with something that, on the surface, sounds almost unbelievable. Russian territory, actual towns and settlements inside Russian borders, has been getting hit by Ukrainian artillery on a regular basis. Not occasionally, not once or twice as some kind of symbolic demonstration. Regularly, routinely. So routinely, in fact, that it has essentially stopped being front-page news. Think about that for a moment. The shelling of Russian soil has become so normalized, so expected, so utterly unremarkable in the daily rhythm of this conflict that it barely registers anymore in the national conversation. It has faded into the background noise of a war that was supposed to be quick, decisive, and overwhelmingly one-sided. And from the Kremlin? Silence. Complete and total silence. No official statements, no press conferences, no acknowledgement that this is even happening in any meaningful way. The only people speaking publicly about it are the regional governors of the territories actually being hit, and they are doing so largely because they have no other choice. Their constituents are living under this reality every single day. But at the highest levels of Russian power, the preferred strategy appears to be simply pretending that it is not happening, or at least pretending that it is not significant enough to warrant a formal response. Now here is where the analysis gets genuinely interesting and genuinely troubling. Anyone with a serious understanding of military operations, and we are not talking about graduates of elite academies here, we are talking about anyone with a working knowledge of how artillery and territorial control actually function, understands a very basic truth. The only real way to stop a military force from shelling your territory with conventional ground-based artillery is to push them far enough back that they physically cannot reach you anymore. That distance, when you do the math based on the range of the systems being used, comes out to somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 kilometers. You cannot negotiate your way to that outcome. You cannot wish your way to it. You cannot hold press briefings and make it happen. You have to physically move the enemy back and then hold that ground. So why is that not happening? This is where the conversation becomes a fascinating and painful study in the gap between military mythology and military reality. Consider for a moment what the United States military did during its operations in Iraq. The Americans deployed enormous numbers of reconnaissance drones and strike-capable unmanned systems, systems that were constantly in the air, constantly scanning, constantly eliminating threats at distances of tens of kilometers, and sometimes well beyond that from any American installation. That capability did not appear out of thin air. It was the product of years of investment, years of development, years of prioritizing technological advancement in unmanned aviation as a core element of military doctrine. While that investment was being made, while those systems were being designed and tested and mass-produced and integrated into tactical operations at scale, what was happening on the other side? What were the priorities? There were elaborate military games, spectacular public demonstrations of equipment that looked impressive on television but served limited practical battlefield function. There were renovation projects in military housing, There were fishing competitions in remote mountain rivers that somehow became associated with senior military figures. And through all of that, the hard, unglamorous, expensive, technically demanding work of developing a genuine mass unmanned tactical aviation capability simply did not happen at the scale required. So now, in the present moment, facing a real conflict with real operational demands, the toolkit available for addressing the shelling problem is limited to methods that would have been familiar to military planners from a much earlier era. The answer has to come from physically occupying buffer territory, creating a zone of control deep enough inside the opposing side's territory to push their artillery out of range. That is the logic. That is the only logic that works given the available resources. And here is where the situation becomes almost darkly ironic. Creating that buffer zone, establishing and holding that kind of operational depth, is not a small undertaking. It is not something you accomplish with a handful of units. It requires a serious, substantial commitment of military force. Not the dozen or so new military units that were announced with considerable fanfare by the defense minister, announcements delivered with the kind of confident, chest-forward energy that tends to accompany proclamations that are more about public relations than operational planning. Announcements like that, about units that will be created at some future point, do not solve present problems. What would actually be needed, according to the hard math of this situation, is not 12 new formations. It is dozens upon dozens of fully equipped, fully staffed combat groups, each one with the complete supporting architecture that makes a frontline unit actually functional. That means artillery support. That means air cover. That means anti-air systems. That means reconnaissance capability. That means logistics chains, command structures, communications. Not just the tip of the spear, but the entire spear. Because the opposing side is not going to simply watch and wait while a buffer zone gets established. They are going to contest every meter of it. So where do those forces come from? This is the question that sits at the center of everything. And the honest answer is that nobody has a satisfying response to it. A general military mobilization, the kind of large-scale call-up that the situation would logically seem to demand, has been publicly ruled out by the Kremlin. That is not happening, at least not officially, at least not yet. Sending conscripts into active combat zones is also off the table, at least according to the stated policy. And the pool of people willing to sign up voluntarily, to take contracts and head to the front, is not an inexhaustible resource. Every month that passes, that pool gets smaller. The people willing to go have largely already gone. The ones remaining are the ones who are not willing or not able, and no amount of recruitment pressure changes that fundamental dynamic. Meanwhile, the losses among those who did go continue to accumulate, and the volunteers being recruited are barely keeping pace with replacing those losses, let alone expanding the overall force. Foreign fighters were floated as a potential solution at various points, with public statements about Syrian volunteers being among the more specific claims made. Where are they? It is a fair question. It was a public promise made directly and specifically. The answer, based on observable reality, appears to be that they are not there in any numbers that matter operationally. What actually exists on the ground is a patchwork. There are badly worn regular military units that have taken serious attrition and are a shadow of their pre-conflict strength. There are private military contractors and various irregular formations filling gaps that the regular forces cannot cover. There are internal security forces that, when faced with the prospect of actual frontline deployment, have demonstrated a tendency toward extreme reluctance, to put it diplomatically. And there are the forces associated with the Chechen leader, which operate according to their own particular logic and serve their own particular purposes. That is the inventory. That is what is available. And when you look at what is available and compare it to what would actually be needed to solve the shelling problem, to push forces back 40 to 50 kilometers and hold that ground against an adversary that has proven considerably more capable and resilient than early assumptions suggested, the gap is enormous. It is not a gap that can be closed with announcements. It is not a gap that can be closed with optimistic press releases. It is a gap that reflects a fundamental mismatch between the scale of the problem and the resources available to address it. The conclusion that follows from all of this is uncomfortable to state, but it is the logical endpoint of the analysis. Russian civilians living in the territories near the border need to adjust their expectations. The shelling is not going to stop in the near term. There is no solution on the immediate horizon that would physically eliminate the threat. And over time, as the conflict continues, the reach and the impact of that shelling is likely to grow rather than diminish. The weapons available to the opposing side are not static. They evolve. They improve. The range extends. The precision increases. What is a border region problem today has the potential to become a problem that reaches further and further into Russian territory as time passes. There is a historical reference point that gets invoked here, and it is a pointed one. The Donbass region, the eastern part of Ukraine that was the site of a years-long conflict before the current situation escalated dramatically, endured artillery fire for 8 consecutive years. 8 years. The people living there developed a kind of grim accommodation to the reality of living under intermittent bombardment. They adapted, they adjusted, they kept living because the alternative was not living, and life finds a way to continue even under conditions that seem incompatible with normalcy. The implication being drawn is that Russian border communities may be embarking on a similar journey, one that requires a similar kind of painful, unwanted adaptation to a new and brutal normal. This is a remarkably candid framing coming from someone who could be expected to have reasons to be defensive or optimistic. It is not the language of someone running a public relations operation. It is the language of someone who has spent enough time around actual military operations to have no patience left for comfortable fictions. And it points to something deeper that is worth sitting with. Something about the relationship between political decisions and military outcomes that has a universal quality to it. The resources that were not invested in the right places over years and decades do not materialize when you need them just because you need them. The capabilities that were not built cannot be conjured into existence on demand. The personnel that were not trained and equipped and maintained at readiness do not suddenly appear because the operational situation requires them. The bill comes due. It always comes due. The only question is who pays it, and in conflicts like this one, the answer to that question is almost always the people who had the least say in the decisions that created the problem in the first place. The broader picture that emerges from all of this is one of a military and political system that made choices over a long period of time that prioritized appearance over capability, spectacle over substance, and short-term political comfort over long-term operational readiness. And now those choices are producing consequences that cannot be spun away or announced away or wished away. The gap between what was claimed and what actually exists is becoming visible in ways that are very difficult to conceal, and the territory being shelled is one of the places where that gap is most visible, most concrete, and most painful for the people who have to live inside it. There is something deeply sobering about watching this play out in real time, about watching the distance between official narrative and operational reality grow wider with each passing week. The people making the announcements and the people living under the artillery fire are having two very different experiences of the same conflict. And the analysis that bridges those two realities, The kind of honest accounting that looks at what is actually available versus what is actually needed is the kind of analysis that tends to be unwelcome in official circles precisely because it is accurate. Truth has a way of being inconvenient, especially when the truth is that there is no quick fix, no clever workaround, no announcement that changes the fundamental arithmetic of the situation. Sometimes the most important thing that honest analysis can do is simply say clearly and plainly what the math shows and let people decide what to do with that information.